Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Durling. This is going to be a great episode, especially if you're a prog rock fan. Got a very special guest talking to Mr. Bob Cesca. Bob, I'm going to explain how we met here in a bit, but introduce yourself to the folks who don't know who you are. I'm sure that a lot of people follow you already, but yeah, tell us about yourself.
Well, the main thing, Tim, and thanks for having me on. The main thing is I'm a podcaster now, but I've done all kinds of things in terms of animation. Obviously, as we're going to discuss today, some graphic design, album cover design, things like that. But right now, I'm mainly a podcaster and writer. I'm operating in the political realm here in the United States, which is always a fun time. It's always a pleasure getting into the red hot plasma stream of American politics and just sticking my face into that every day. But yeah, that's what I kind of do. And it's going to be interesting talking about this album cover and the entire Yes Magnification project from my perspective. It's an interesting period of time for Yes's history, and I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Absolutely. So yeah, so Bob hinted at it. I got to know Bob because he was a very special guest on one of the Rush fans deep dives, which I'm privileged to sit in on every month with Ryan Murphy from Rush fans and the one and only Donna Halper. And so we've been going in reverse order. And so every month we would have a rotating fourth person to comment. And when we did our moving pictures run through, which is, just type in Rush fans, all one word, moving pictures deep dive, you'll find it. Bob was the fourth commentator on that. He did an excellent dissertation of, I believe it was Red Barchetta.
Yes. Yeah. One of my favorite Rush tracks. Yeah, absolutely.
And so as I do, I notice, when I see, album covers and things in the background, I looked over Bob's shoulder and I said, Bob, it looks like you've got vinyl of Yes Magnification and also Symphonic Yes, which are kind of rare, even more so on vinyl.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so Bob says, yeah, not only do I have them on vinyl, I actually designed those covers. So I thought, tuck that nugget away. And when we're done talking about moving pictures, I'll see if Bob wants to come on and talk about working with Yes. I mean, there's only a few people that have done that. I mean, there's Roger Dean,
Yeah.
there's whoever designed the 90125 and Big Generator, which aren't great. But yeah, so Bob is the album cover designer for Magnification and also Symphonic
Yes.
Live, I guess. So Bob, talk me through how you ended up working, for one of the classic prog rock bands of all time.
Yeah, it's a crazy story, Tim. I had always been into graphic design. In fact, that was going to be my area of concentration in college. This was going to be my major in college. And as a matter of circumstances, once I got to college, I had already burned myself out with art at that point. I was in AP art in high school, and I just had enough. So I changed my major. But suffice to say, it was something that I've always been interested in, and I've always dabbled in it. So when the time came to start working on the internet in the middle to late 1990s, I quickly discovered that you could make animated cartoons on the internet and relatively easily. And I'd always done caricatures and comic book art and things like that. And so I started creating animated cartoons using this Flash software that existed. It was very popular around the turn of the century, around 2000, right around there. And I made this cartoon called Napster Bad. And it was a cartoon that satirized Metallica's crusade against Napster.
That was you.
That was me. That was absolutely me. Yeah.
So I've laughed. Listen, I've had endless laughs. Fire bad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was it. I'm amazed you remember. That was 22 years ago.
Yeah.
May of 2000. I released that cartoon, and it was one of the big viral hits of that time. There were a bunch of other animators. Joe Cartoon, who was a friend of mine, did a bunch of, gerbil in a blender. And I don't know, he did like a rat in a microwave, things like that. That was sort of the sorts of things that we were doing with Flash animation back then. But Napster Bad kind of hit in a big way. We were getting millions and millions of downloads. And so I got contacted by this guy named Jordan Burliant. And he happened to have been the manager for Motley Crue. And Nikki Sixx had heard about this or had seen this Napster Bad cartoon and wanted me to do a response cartoon by Motley Crue to Metallica's Napster lawsuit. And so I did a cartoon with, Motley Crue. I wrote up the comedy script and everything like that, emailed it to Nikki and the band, and they went in the recording studio and recorded all the dialogue and then sent it back to me, and I made a cartoon out of it. And through that process, I developed a business relationship, a friendship with Jordan Burliant. And we decided to go up to New York City and pitch an animated sketch comedy series to VH1, to a contact, this guy, Bruce Gilmer at VH1. And so I went up to New York City and met with Jordan. And as we're standing around in his hotel room waiting to go to this meeting, I notice on his laptop, he's got Yes's The Ladder album cover on his laptop. I said, "Oh, you're a Yes fan. I'm a huge Yes fan." And he goes, "Yeah, I manage Yes." I said, "Well, how did you not tell me this?
Yeah.
All of these
By the
months
way,
that we've known." Yeah. Yeah. And so at that point in time, I think Billy had just left the band after performing and writing on The Ladder. And so it was a transitional period of time. I remember one of the things that we talked about in the cab on the way to this VH1 meeting was the fact that, yeah, Yes was working on a new album. And the concept at that point in time was going to be the whole album was going to be 1 hour long song. And so they were like, John really, I think, was getting ambitious in terms of, let's really own this epic prog rock thing and make something that's modern and new after the 80s and 90s. Let's do this thing. And so that was one of the discussions that was in progress. And we kind of dropped it at that point. And then once the TV show actually got greenlit with VH1, this animated sketch comedy show I was doing, the discussion came about, well, who's going to do the theme song? And Jordan said, well, why don't we get Yes is in studio right now. Why don't we get Yes to do the theme song? So yeah, Yes recorded a theme song for this animated sketch comedy show. Ultimately, it was rejected by the network because
I was going to say, what was the sketch show called?
It eventually became known as VH1 Illustrated, with the emphasis on ill.
Okay.
It came down from the executive who was running VH1 at the time. I wasn't a big fan of it, but the original concept for the show was going to be called Camp Chaos, which was named after the website that I ran at the time, where I posted Napster Bad and all these other cartoons.
I'm just picturing Lars with the shifty eyes.
Yeah. And so in the process of working with Yes and knowing that Magnification was in development at that time, they were recording it in Santa Barbara. Jordan called me up one day and he said, they're looking for a new direction in terms of their album art. And I don't know what the politics were behind the scenes in terms of who came up with this idea that they weren't going to work with Roger Dean. I don't know. I mean, Steve Howe writes about this a little bit in his latest book, about someone in the band, probably John, decided, maybe we do something different with the album cover this time around. And so I think Roger had actually created artwork for Magnification. And that's where I come in. And I was asked by Jordan to develop some ideas for the album cover. So I started putting together some rough drafts, things that might work for, and he was sending me tracks from the album. I was having a lot of phone conversations because I was out in Pennsylvania. Of course, the album's being recorded in Santa Barbara. So I spent a lot of time on the phone with John Anderson, who is, as Yes history is told, is always involved with every aspect of the creative process. And so we had a lot of interesting ideas floating around in terms of creating a concept for this, not just a cover that would somehow be symbolic of the sound and the vibe of the album, but an overall storyline, a narrative that could maybe be developed over several albums, but certainly would get started with Magnification. And the idea was about this scientist who discovers this ancient talisman, this ancient, stone structure that kind of looks like it's kind of a relative of the Elias from Sun Hillo symbol that, is
Yes.
sort of synonymous with John Anderson's work. And of course, that album. And so this talisman was adapted by the scientists. This is the whole concept that we eventually landed on. There were a lot of iterations that came before it, but
What we're looking at here, Bob?
yeah, that's it.
Okay.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I created that in CG and kind of adapted it in a similar way as the Elias symbol, knowing that it could all be part of the same. This is the year 2000. We're talking about a shared universe between Yes projects, right? We're trying to connect Elias to this Yes album concept for Magnification. And so this scientist comes up with a modern version of the talisman using spheres and vacuums and computer technology and everything like that. The idea was this sort of rotating set of glass orbs would open up a dimension into, harmonic convergence and all the John Anderson things, to alternate realities. It creates some form of harmonics and musical vibes that would eventually be like the sound of the album. That was kind of the concept of it. And so, but what we wanted to do, I had started out doing a much more intricate album cover with other elements in there. And as John and I further discussed it, we decided to, this is mainly a John thing. He wanted to pare down the cover so that it was simpler, so that when you see the overall storyline, as you open up the liner notes and you see some of the pencil sketches and things like that, it's like opening a book. You have a simple cover, but then you have all of the interesting concept inside the rest of the package design. And so that's how the cover became more simplified, the space scene. I wasn't entirely satisfied with just putting stars and nebulas and things like that. So I worked in some star charts and some other things, some other interesting little details, Easter eggs and things like that you can find on the album cover, just to spruce it up a little bit. I mean, I gotta be honest, Tim, it was immensely stressful. Knowing the history of the band, when a quote unquote interloper would join the band, Trevor Rabin, for example.
Yeah.
When Trevor Rabin joined the band, all the Yes fans were like, well, who the hell is this guy? And why is he replacing our favorite guitar player of all time, Steve Howe?
Trevor Horn.
Yeah, Trevor Horn's another great example. I mean, Trevor Horn talks about, Trevor Horn would talk about, to this day, he still has nightmares about sitting in a limo with Chris Squire pulling up to Madison Square Garden, and Chris Squire has a Walkman. He says, oh, hey, here's this Yes song. You've never heard it before, but we're going to play it tonight. You have to sing it. and then, of course, he wakes up in a cold sweat.
Yeah.
So it was that kind of vibe working on that project, knowing that no matter what I did, the entire Yes fandom who had come up with Roger Dean's artwork, recognizing that as being, the sixth member of Roger Dean being the sixth member of Yes, basically, that whoever replaced Roger Dean, albeit temporarily, it was just going to be a couple albums, would automatically be suspect. I was just imagining, fans kind of giving me the skunk eye, like, who's this guy Bob, this cartoonist who made fun of Metallica?
It'd be like if Rush did one album that Hugh Syme didn't do the album cover for.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
What?
Yeah, it was all at once completely understandable as a fan, as someone who loves Roger Dean's artwork, who's a huge Yes fan, as a lot of us are. Rush is number one for me. Yes is number two for me. And so I understood that point of view, but that also added pressure. Like, how would I react if someone else came in, replaced Roger Dean? Or how did I react to, some of the album covers, the Trevor Rabin era album covers in the 1980s? And I do like the idea, generally speaking, of bands trying new things, of, kind of forging new trails for themselves. And that's never always, it's never a bad, especially when you're talking about progressive rock. I mean, the whole idea of progressive rock is you're constantly striving for more. You're pushing yourself beyond your limit to come up with something new and different each time you come out with a new album. I mean, Rush is a perfect example of that, where
Yeah.
you listen to one Rush album and it doesn't sound like anything that came before it or anything that came after. It's its own thing representing that period of time. Anyway, so in that sense, I kind of rationalized it in my head. It didn't make it any less stressful. So, and I knew right away that once John wanted to pare down the complexity of the cover, I knew that was going to be a little bit of trouble. So it's one of those things where I'm proud of the work on Magnification. I'm honored to have been invited to participate with the band, to get to know Chris Squire, for example, who, he and I became, relatively close in that period of time, where I ended up doing a cover for he and Billy Sherwood's Conspiracy album.
Okay.
They did an album called The Unknown, which I think is their second album. And so I did all the package art for that too. When Yes would come around, I would, see Chris backstage and we would hang out, and Chris was great. John Anderson, I still keep in touch with to this day. I'll send him an email once in a while and we'll carry on a little bit of a catch up conversation. But I'm getting way off the beaten path here, but needless to say, the album cover was not met enthusiastically, which I do regret. Yeah. And see that the way that looks right now, that looks like a copy of a copy. That looks, I don't know, maybe it's the video screen. Maybe it's
it could
video.
be. I know what it is really hard to make out much detail. I think what I've got here is a reissue. I only bought this. I only found this a few years ago. So it might be just that. But I will say this, it's easier to make out than this Russian cassette that I found.
Yeah, there are some awful reproductions floating around the internet right now.
Yeah.
And that brings up a whole separate thing. When we got around to the 20th anniversary of the release of the album this past fall, ironically enough, or horribly enough, as if, coming in and being a interloper in the band's history.
I know where you're going with this.
The album ended up dropping on 9/11.
Yeah.
And so that was an extra layer of darkness that kind of surrounded that album, which, by the way, is wonderful from a music perspective.
Great.
It's
yeah.
Interesting. Once again, it progresses. It doesn't sound like anything Yes had done up to that point. Obviously, the symphony orchestra had a lot to do with that. But the songwriting too was a little less overproduced, I should say. It's more, it has a live feel to it insofar as you can hear each instrument and it's very well separated. The dynamics are interesting too. So it's a beautiful album. There's some wonderful Yes songs on there.
Yeah.
But it just, because of circumstances, because of bad timing, it really didn't catch on the way I think it should have. So when the anniversary came around last year, I decided to revisit the album art and create something fresh and new that wasn't necessarily, I didn't recreate the album cover. I just wanted to inject a new version of it into the internet realm. You know what I mean? Where all these awful copies of copies. They're either too dark or they're blown out. They generally look awful. In fact, it's really painful to go do a Google search for this album, for this particular album cover.
Yeah, so it's not very clear, which is a shame, because I can tell, I can see, my eyesight's not what it used to be, but I can tell there's a lot of work that went into this. And yeah, it's almost like they took a Polaroid of it and made that the cover.
Yeah. And I didn't get to see the cover until the band had already been on tour. They had already released an EP of Don't Go and In the Presence Of. And that was only available at the concert venues. But then when the album finally came out, there was a signing in Philadelphia at a bookstore. And that was the first time I saw the cover printed. And it was it was talk about a stressful moment. It was not fun, because if I had seen that, if I had seen some sort of galleys or proof of the cover, I would have made some adjustments accordingly for the ultimate end product. And that, for whatever circumstances, that didn't happen either. But overall, I'm still happy with the concept. I'm still happy with the way the album cover looks on vinyl. There have been some reissues recently, in particular the one that's behind me here, that looks great. And so, as I was saying before, when it came down to 2021 last year, I created not only a fresh version of the original art, but then I did an updated 20th anniversary version of the cover that involves that spherical device that, that in the story, that's built by the scientist, et cetera, to open up other dimensions of reality and so on. And so I incorporated that into the cover art. And the idea was I was just going to donate it to the band. They had already paid me back in 2001 when the album came out. And so I figured, well, I'm just going to do this and then hand it off. I'd been in contact with the band's management. And so I handed it off to them, and then also posted it online myself, posted in some of the forums and on Facebook and on my website, et cetera, Instagram and whatnot, just to try to seed the internet with an updated version to hopefully supersede all of the crappy versions that have been floating around. So that's out there somewhere. I mean, the new artwork, if you look for it, it's around.
And it's worth seeking out too, because I have seen it. It looks a lot better.
Yeah. It's more appropriate for printing. It's more appropriate for digital downloads, for viewing online, which is primarily where people are getting their music now anyway. And so, but again, it was meant to kind of correct the record a little bit as far as some of the things that had happened to the artwork over the years. What happens is someone will get a copy that's too dark, and then they'll scan it, and then they'll brighten it up, but too much, and it'll look blown out. Anyway, there have been stories like this throughout the history of rock and roll and album covers. I know Rush has had issues with printing corrosive steel. There was an error with the printing on that. There was even an error with their first album. I think the logo is supposed to be red and it came out pink.
It was like hot pink. Yeah,
fuchsia. Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
And so it does happen, and it happens to artists much better than me. That's for sure. But fortunately, I did have a second chance to kind of do something that was more in keeping with my own concept for what a Yes album should look like. The Magnification album was more of a collaboration with John. But when it came around to Yes Symphonic Live, I really took my time with that one and developed it almost in a vacuum, where I created it, sent it to the band. It got, everyone seemed to like it, and so they used it. There was no, and that's the other thing I like to. I like to create not just the cover, but other Easter eggs and other.
Oh, you need the secondary. You need the secondary and the tertiary art to go with it.
Yeah.
This is all very, very Yes looking. I even like the individual icons here.
Well, that was the great thing about working in CG. That's all. Magnification was, I think, more a Photoshop sort of graphic design kind of project, whereas Yes Symphonic Live was created entirely in a CG environment. In fact, I was able to animate certain elements of it for some of the little viral videos that the band released around it. I think there was a video for Don't Go that I shot that was supposed to be just for the internet, like an internet bonus feature. And I did some animated elements from the Yes Symphonic Live cover that got incorporated into that video. So the CG design, being in that environment, allowed me to do different versions of the cover, do different lighting, do different settings for that talisman, different environments. There were lots of lots of space to work in. There was lots of variations that I could incorporate into the album art without doing a whole lot of additional work. So I'm much happier with the way Yes Symphonic Live turned out. And from there, that's after that project, that's when I did the Chris Squire, Billy Sherwood album cover for The Unknown. And that was more or less it. And it's again, it was one of those things where I was not thrilled with the experience, but then I realized that that working with Yes always comes with a price. Where just reading again, you go to people like the two Trevors, or even when Billy Sherwood, prior to Billy Sherwood becoming the permanent bass player, Billy also got a lot of side eye from fans. And so in that sense, I felt like I was kind of initiated. It was kind of a, I don't know what you would call it, a hazing.
I was just
so
going to
to
say
speak.
hazing,
Like,
yeah. And it's a pretty exclusive. It's a pretty. I mean, there's been a lot of people come through, but it's a pretty exclusive club, really.
Yeah. And I'm extremely satisfied now because there's a whole new generation of fans, and they learned about Yes right around the time Magnification came out. And in that regard, because they hadn't spent decades with Roger's artwork, they came to love the artwork for Magnification. There's quite a few, YouTube videos and people doing reaction videos and things like that to Magnification. And there are quite a few relatively new fans who really enjoy the artwork. And so in that sense, I feel gratified, and I feel a little bit vindicated because of that.
And even, I mean, it has to be said, even on the albums that you designed, they still have to credit Roger Dean because of the logo.
Because of the logo, yeah,
so he's,
absolutely.
It's like, calm down, fans. His name is still on there. Man, I got to say, even with the issues with the printing of this,
yeah,
I'd take this. No offense to Peter Max, but I take this over the Talk album cover any day.
Yeah.
Because what a mess that one is. But anyway, we're not here to discuss Talk. But so the symphonic, my copy has a copyright. It says 2002/2009. So I'm guessing this is a reissue.
Yeah, probably.
And so Magnification, as Yes fans know, was the last Yes studio album for 10 years. And a lot happened in that 10 years. I mean, Rick Wakeman came back and left again. But the biggest news, of course, John Anderson's out, and they got Benoit in, and then finally John Davison, and then they re-record, or they do Fly From Here. And so your version, you're dealing with Yes basically as a 4-piece. So because they're the whole reason that they did the album with a symphony is because they didn't happen to have a keyboard player, because Rick Wakeman had left. They'd lost Igor Koroshev. He was out of the picture. Yeah. So you've talked about discussions with Chris Squire and John Anderson. What about Steve Howe and Alan White?
Alan White, I interacted with a few times, and he was great. My stepdaughter was a drummer at the time, just learning. She was very young, about 10 years old, but sort of a prodigy on drums, and she picked it up right away. And so when we saw Yes backstage at one of the Philadelphia shows, Alan White took the time out to talk with my stepdaughter at the time about playing drums, and they had their own little conversation off in the corner. I always appreciate that. And I spent some time with Alan in Santa Barbara when they were recording Magnification. Steve, I interacted with in Santa Barbara, and we seemed to get along just fine. He's a bit of a wild card, though, when it comes to Magnification, because he's good friends with Roger Dean. And so he was the one guy in the band who was saying, we need to go with Roger's artwork on this. And then when he was overruled on that, I think he resented the fact that, it was some guy who he didn't know was being brought in by John and the management to take Roger's job from him. And so I think consequently, and I've seen Steve's biography, he's not thrilled with either the album itself or the album art. And he's typically Steve about it. I mean, he's doesn't pull any punches when it comes to Magnification, at least in his book. And that was kind of hard to it's hard to read. As a fan, as someone who loves Steve Howe's playing, and
you put a lot of work in. I mean, like it or not, you did put a lot of work into this. But I guess somebody once said it's the music business, it's not the music fun.
That's exactly right. Well, again, I go back to the interloper aspect of all of this. Yes is unusual insofar as I said before, there's a lot of skepticism when it comes to new members of the band, new people coming in, new management, things like that. And a lot of that is based on past experience where they either got burned by something. I don't think they were particularly thrilled with I know John was into it, but I don't think the rest of the band was particularly thrilled with the cover for Going for the One, the Hypnosis work on that. And they certainly didn't like the cover for Tormato, which they famously, they threw tomatoes at it. They didn't like it so much.
I've read it one time or another. All five of them have claimed they were the ones that threw the tomato. So yeah, obviously.
That's right. So I feel in a sense that I am a part of Yes history insofar as I not only did these two album covers, but they're also infamous in terms of replacing Roger Dean and there being a natural bias because of that fact. So, you could do the best artwork in the world and do exactly something that would fit the vibe of Yes without copying Roger Dean. And still, I think you'd be met with a lot of skepticism.
Whether if Hugh Syme designed a Yes album cover, they'd probably be like, it's not Roger Dean.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, and that's, I think in terms of influence for me, Hugh Syme was one of the biggest influences, and that was something that when I first started to approach Magnification, I was thinking a lot less Roger Dean and a lot more Hugh Syme as far as my approach.
I could see that with the inner graphics. Like that's whether Hugh was designing a tour book or a DVD package, it was never just about the front cover art. It had to extend all the way through. And
yeah. And there's some earlier concepts for the Magnification cover that I think the guys at Yes Music Podcast, I sent them some copies of some work in progress things for Magnification, and they posted it on their website. And that was all, in fact, there are a couple that look like, rough drafts for something that Hugh might have done. I really enjoy the way Hugh works in sort of tableaus and works in that sort of surreal realism. I don't know how you would describe it.
I know what you mean. It's odd. Like parts of it, like a situation that could happen in everyday life, but then all of a sudden there's one thing that doesn't fit.
Yeah. And I also like how he works in different scales where the scaling of the objects, he mix and matches something that's you recognize as being small, but it's actually quite large. And then the people are very small. So it's that sort of thing that I initially brought in, but then of course in a collaborative process. And this is indicative of Yes recordings, whether it's the music, whether it's the stage design, things like that. Yes is always collaborative. And Bill Bruford talks about how frustrating that was in the Fragile Close to the Edge days, where they would sit and debate for hours whether the next note in the song was E or E flat. And that would go on for hours and hours and hours, if not days and days and days.
I think that's why he left.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that striving for pursuing a vision, I think you really have to take your hat off to John Anderson, to an extent, Chris Squire, for having a vision for something and then really pushing forward, irrespective of relationships, in pursuit of that vision. And that's something to be admired. I mean, given the fact that the 70s were only a short period of time, and then you get in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, where creative freedom was a lot more restrictive, where, musical tastes had moved on. The fact that they still aggressively pursued their vision for these albums, whether they were successful albums or not. uh, they still could sleep at night knowing that their integrity was intact. And that's something that's ultimately to be admired. So in hindsight, I was 29, I think, when I was working with John on the early Magnification designs. And I didn't necessarily appreciate it then, but in retrospect, I really appreciate it now. The collaborative effort and how that manifests itself into a better creative product at the very end of it. So that all, I think, is it was a great and I would say educational process for me to have gone through while I was still in my 20s and not entirely confident in my ability, certainly not confident enough to say, oh yeah, I can totally top Roger Dean. I never had that, never had that delusion in my head. It was never lost on me that I showed up out of nowhere basically and had this opportunity. But at no point did I ever think that this was somehow going to be, oh yeah, I'm totally going to be better than Roger Dean.
You're going to be Yes's cover guy or design guy from here on in.
Yeah, no, that was never the case. And besides, I had known enough about Yes's history that that was never going to happen. That is, I think, part of Yes's MO is do a little bit of this and see how it plays and then move on to the next thing and do a little bit of that. You know, it's like the transition between drama and 90125 couldn't be more glaring, or the transition between relayer and going for the one couldn't be more obvious and clear. Whether it's the album art itself or the music and what have you, the personnel in the band.
What's a good point to think about, you mentioned 90125, which, I mean, at my age, that's when Owner of Lonely Hearts, first thing I ever heard from Yes, I was like 9 years old. I didn't know, you know what I mean? Like, they were a brand new band to me then, and I think I speak for a lot of kids my age. I mean, that was our introduction. A Roger Dean cover art for 90125, I don't think would have worked. It would have looked too old. No. You know?
Yeah. And you know what, in the context of the early mid 80s, 90125 and even Big Generator, which is often listed among the least favorite Yes album covers, that looks really 80s. And you have to put yourself in that period of time. And you could even apply this to Magnification, where I think the general public had moved on from progressive rock, and seeing at the time in record stores an ornate kind of trippy landscape with floating rocks and things and organic shapes and everything, you immediately go, oh, well, that's the 70s. We're in the 80s now, you know, live in the now, get with the times.
You wouldn't want it to look like, oh, that must be a reissue.
Yeah.
That must be an old album reissue. And another thing, I suppose, you know, someone out there is probably screaming at me. The other thing about not using Roger Dean for 90125 is because Roger Dean was doing Asia.
Oh,
so
yeah.
you would have had competition there. So,
but very, very different Roger Dean material than what we saw in the 1980s. More graphical. It was, it had a creature in it. I mean, the first Asia album is a wonderful album cover.
Yes, it is.
And it's, I think it works with that sea serpent and the orb and everything. It's interesting, and it doesn't feel like the 70s necessarily. So, you know, it's entirely possible that if Roger had been called in to do 90125, that he would have done something a little more 80s and a little less 70s. But I think the idea was, well, this is a new band. Originally started, they were going to be called Cinema before John rejoined and then Tony Kaye rejoined. And so in that respect, I think they were trying a new approach. And when you get to 2000 and 2001 with Magnification, who knew what the hell the music industry was going to be? Who knew what the hell the music listening and buying public was going to be attracted to in a record store, or even if they were going to record stores in the first place, if not downloading online and so on had started at that point. So how do you grab people? I mean, an album cover, first and foremost, is a marketing tool.
Yeah.
I mean, from the crass kind of business, sterile, corporate
You
perspective.
got to catch somebody's eye.
Yeah. So what the hell do you do? And if you're Yes and you've been around since 1968 and you're trying to sell records in the year 2001, what do you do? Do you do something that looks like your albums in the 70s or the 80s, or do you try something different with the hopes that modern audiences will say, I mean, outside of the fandom, and because you always know that the fans are always going to buy the record no matter what it is, it's the other people, the casual fans, the casual listeners, people who might be exploring something new. How do you grab them with a cover? And what are they going to be seeing? Are they going to be seeing in a little teeny tiny thumbnail? I mean, remember 2000, 2001, people are still on dial-up modems at that
Yeah.
point in time. So the album art's teeny tiny. You can't get too detailed with it because it gets lost. I think Magnification maybe had fell victim to that very thing. The fact that it was primarily getting marketed on the internet, which meant smaller graphics, more compressed graphics. And from there, we have some of the problems that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the thing. And I think from that perspective, saying, well, maybe we try something that's not Roger and see if that sticks to the wall. And I don't know how the album sold. I assume it didn't sell that well. But I admire Yes for trying it. And I certainly am grateful that they talked to me and asked me to do it, because it was a once in a lifetime chance. I mean, that was the thing. When I was in college in, the late 80s or into the early 90s, my roommate and I had been recording prog rock. I played bass guitar myself. And so we had been writing and recording progressive music in college and talking about, oh, wouldn't it be great if, we got to work with Yes or one of the members of Yes. And we'd always talk about Yes album covers. You fast forward 10 years and suddenly I'm on a first name basis with the members of Yes. I have their secret names for their hotel rooms. You know what I mean? Their secret celebrity names for their hotel rooms in case I need to contact them about whatever. So that was a huge privilege that will never, irrespective of who says what about the album cover, for me, that experience is worth its weight in gold, no doubt about it. And fortunately for me, and being able to be comfortable with that work, there was Yes Symphonic that I was a lot more proud of from a design perspective.
Yeah, this is it's got the green, it puts you in mind of Close to the Edge a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily 70s looking. It does what it's supposed to do. And also, you got a bigger logo on there. And I think once people take a good look at it, this is a classic looking Yes album cover without looking like an older album cover in a different shade.
Yeah. And it's obviously I still see the mistakes in there. Even with Yes Symphonic, which I'm extremely happy with, I still see the mistakes. I still notice the fact that the CD cover crops out the talisman, which is actually, if you see the DVD cover, the more vertically rectangular DVD cover, the talisman, you can see it clearly in the lower right hand corner. And those rings are supposed to be part of the talisman, and they go off and they bring harmonic convergence to the universe, and then they come back to the talisman, refuel, power up with new energy, and then they go back out. And also, I should add that at that period of time, John Anderson was super into crop circles. I mean, that was one of the main things that we talked about quite a bit is crop circles.
Yeah.
So I incorporated some form of crop circles in there. They were formed by the rings from the talisman. So he
seems like an interesting guy.
He is a wonderfully fascinating and completely unique guy. I remember just having these endless conversations about some of his short stories, talking about, he would call me up and talk to me about light beings and how he's seen light beings and the experience of being in the world of light beings, and just a fascinating guy, interesting concepts in terms of spirituality and how music is incorporated all into that. The John Anderson that you see in interviews and the writing and the mystical things, almost like he's someone who got in a time machine in Middle Earth and landed here. That's the real John Anderson.
That's him. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's also he's a regular guy when that's the context of the conversation. He can talk about politics. He can talk about pop culture. He can talk about Monty Python. I remember we had a whole conversation about Monty Python at the recording studio in Santa Barbara. That was a trippy time where I was sitting there with Alan, John, and Chris, and we were all talking about Monty Python in the lobby of the recording studio. It's just like those little memories I'll never forget.
Awesome. Wow. That's just a cool little glimpse. You got to play that part in the history of Yes. And you should be very proud of the work that you did. Both of these albums, like Magnifications is an album that gets better the more that it's listened to. And the purple separates it, there's not a lot of purple album covers, and the Symphonic Live. I mean, there's a lot of Yes live albums, but I'm always, as a kid in the '80s, I always like when they give a nod to Owner of a Lonely Heart, or I even enjoyed when John, Trevor Rabin, and Rick Wakeman did their version of Yes, because that's the only way you were ever going to hear Rhythm of Love, or Lift Me Up, or Changes, So yeah, being an '80s kid, I really liked Fly From Here. Wasn't a fan of Heaven and Earth, and I quite liked The Quest, which of course, and like you said, they tried it, but they've gone back to Roger Dean, and that's where they've stayed. But
yeah, and I'm completely satisfied with that. I'm completely happy with the fact that Roger's their guy and will always be their guy. Is synonymous with the sound. I mean, his visuals kind of represent their. If you were to put the music into visual form, it would be a Roger Dean painting. It's so perfect and appropriate for their style of music, and so they're inextricable, those Roger and the band. No matter who's in the band, Roger's artwork is always going to fit with that for sure.
Very cool. So Bob, this has been great. Thank you for taking some time out to to discuss your time as part of the inner workings of one of the classic prog rock bands, one of the classic rock bands of all time.
Yeah.
So where can people find you? Where can people get in touch with Bob?
Okay. Well, my podcast website is bobcesca.com. Somewhere in there, if you go to bobcesca.com and you search for Yes Magnification, the new album artwork, the page for that will come up. So you can see the 20th anniversary edition of the Magnification artwork. I wanted to add real quick, Tim, that in the past few months, maybe in the past, 6 months, at some point, Magnification finally got added to Apple Music and also Spotify. Unfortunately, this is why I'm not hard to find. You can very easily find me just with a quick Google search, but the version of Magnification that goes with those two things, this is so in keeping with the whole history of that album cover. For some reason, they used a work in progress version of the Magnification cover. Yeah, like something that has a glaring mistake in it that we eventually fixed, and before it went to press and so on. But somehow they got their hands on this. I don't know. It's an earlier version, a rejected earlier version of the cover, and that's what they put in there. So it's not. If you can get the new version, the 20th anniversary edition of the cover, make that your avatar for your digital copy of Magnification.
Do it yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Because the one they've got up there, and I've talked to the band's management about it, and they evidently alerted both of the platforms to fix that, but they haven't been fixed yet. So that's the saga continues.
You got to, but that I suppose at this point you just kind of chuckle at that and say, oh well.
Yeah, there's nothing I can do to reverse time and call up Roger Dean and say, hey, why don't you go and why
Yeah.
did you do the cover for this? Why?
Yeah.
But no, I'm so happy that I had that opportunity. I cannot emphasize that enough. It was a chance of a lifetime, and I'm just thrilled to have been a part of it. And I'm very gratified, as I said before, that there are a lot of new fans that really do appreciate that artwork.
Excellent. Well, you can you can also follow Bob on Twitter and Instagram. And like he
Yes.
said, he's easy to find. And yeah, I would say if you're if you're watching this, your chances are you're a Yes fan. Go back and listen to Magnification. Give it another go, and maybe print yourself off the real artwork, and which I've got to do, and stick that in your CD cover rather than whatever you want to, rather than this reissue. And
I tell you what, I'll send you a direct link, Tim, to the new artwork, so
perfect.
you have it. You can include it with the description of the show.
Yeah, I will do that.
Great.
So thanks, Bob, and
thank you,
everyone, for watching this episode of Tim's Final Confessions.